Welcome, learners. Welcome to our lecture on terrorism and social ethics. It is our second lecture on the topic terrorism. First lecture was on terrorism, its causes and consequences. Today, we are going to talk about terrorism and social ethics. In this lecture, we'll be examining terrorism from an ethical perspective, exploring how societies can respond to terrorism while upholding key ethical principles. We will also be analyzing moral dilemmas, the concept of responsibility, and the ethical implications of state response to terrorism. Ultimately, our goal is to better understand how social ethics can guide us in addressing terrorism in a way that respect both security and human dignity. So let us start with understanding what social ethics is. Social ethics is the study of moral questions and principles that govern how individuals and societies should act in relation to one another. Social ethics deals with broader implications of morality in society, examining issues of justice, fairness, and common good. And in the context of terrorism, social ethics focuses on the ethical consideration surrounding the use of violence and the role of the state and the impact of terrorism on the society. So, social ethics help us to grapple with difficult questions such as how society should respond to act of terrorism, what constitutes justifiable use of force, and how to protect citizens without violating human rights. Now, let us start with some of the moral dilemmas that are associated with terrorism. First of the dilemma that is associated with terrorism is the justification of violence. Now, the justification of violence is the central moral dilemma when we are discussing about terrorism, whether violence can ever be morally justified. Can terrorist act be defended if they are carried out in pursuit of a legitimate cause? This question is particularly relevant in situations where oppressed groups feel that they have no other means of achieving justice or freedom. In the last lecture, we have seen that what are some of the causes of terrorism. So there we saw that there is some kind of resentment, there is some feeling of alienation, or there is some kind of, not having the faith in the government. So can there be situations where an act of violence can be justified? If the end goal is considered to be justified, can the mean of using the violence be justified in those situations? So that's the question here. So some may argue that in these cases, terrorism could be seen as a last resort when all other options have failed. However, ethical frameworks offer different perspectives on this issue. So, one framework talks about the just war. Just war theory holds that violence is only justifiable under certain conditions, such as self defense or protecting innocent lives. And even then, it must be proportional and discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. So, violence against civilians can never be justified. Another approach is pacifism, which rejects the use of violence entirely. There is no flexibility, there are no conditions under which violence can be justified. So, they argue that violence begets more violence and it can never be morally acceptable means to achieve a particular goal. So means goal cannot justify the use of means. If goal is good, it doesn't mean that whatever means we use to achieve that goal are also good. So here let us take a one example. Consider the example of oppressed groups fighting for liberation. Some argue that in case like apartheid, South Africa, or colonial struggles, violent resistance could be seen as a necessary part of the fight for justice. However, others argue that terrorism, which often targets civilians, can never be justified, regardless of the cause. The ethical dilemma lies in balancing the legitimate grievances of oppressed groups with the moral imperatives to avoid violence and harm to innocent people. Second moral dilemma associated with terrorism is with the collective responsibility versus individual responsibility. So, here the question is, who is responsible? A critical ethical question in the context of terrorism is, who bears the responsibility of act of terrorism? Is it solely the individual terrorist, or do we also hold accountable the group or society that radicalizes them? Terrorism does not occur in vacuum. It is often the result of complex societal factors, which we have already looked in the previous lecture quite elaboratively. So, we know that there are some societal factors as poverty, discrimination, or political oppression, which can contribute to radicalization. So, this leads us to concept of collective responsibility, where society as a whole may bear some responsibility for creating the conditions that allow terrorism to flourish. So, for example, if a government enacts policies that marginalize certain groups or fails to address systemic injustice, it can contribute to radicalization of individuals who see violence as their only recourse. So, can only the individual be held responsible, or a society as a whole, political system as a whole, can be held responsible? Now, let us examine the role of state policies and international relations that leads to terrorism. In some cases, foreign interventions or oppressive domestic policies may create the conditions that breed resentment and radicalization. For instance, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the subsequent destabilization of the region are often cited as factors contributing to the rise of terrorist groups like ISIS. So, in this context, is the state partially responsible for the terrorism that emerges as a result of its action? This ethical question forces us to consider not only individual responsibility, but also broader societal and political context in which terrorism occurs. Now, the third moral dilemma associated with this act of terrorism is about social ethics and state responses to terrorism. So, first one could be force by state as a response to terrorism can be justified or cannot be justified. So, when state responds to terrorism, they often use force in the form of military intervention or drone strikes or special operations to target terrorist group. However, this raises important ethical question about the justification of state violence. Is it ethically permissible for a state to use lethal force in the name of protecting the citizen? And if so, what limits should be placed on this use of force to ensure that it is just and proportionate? While protecting citizens from terrorism is a fundamental responsibility of any government, there is always a risk of counter-terrorism measures that may harm innocent civilians, either through collateral damage or unintended consequences. So, this leads to difficult moral dilemmas about balancing the need for security with the protection of human rights and dignity. So, here we can cite one example, the example of ethical concerns surrounding drone strikes in the war on terror. While drone strikes have been effective in eliminating high profile terror leaders, they have also been criticized for causing civilian casualties. These unintended deaths raise a serious ethical question: is the loss of innocent lives an acceptable price to pay for targeting terrorists? How do we ensure that counter-terrorism efforts are both effective and just? There could also be dehumanization of conflict associated with the use of drone. When killing is done remotely, some argues that it desensitizes operators and societies to the moral weight of taking human life. Furthermore, there is lack of transparency in drone strikes, particularly concerning civilian causalities, calls into questions the ethics of their widespread use. Then there is a question of civil liberty versus national security. If we talk about the 9/11 attacks, after this attack, many countries around the world, particularly the United States, implemented stricter national security measures. One of the most controversial outcomes was the increased surveillance of the citizens, which is often with limited oversight. Governments introduced legislation like the USA Patriot Act, which gave law enforcement agencies greater authority to monitor phone calls, emails, and other private communication. So these measures were seen as necessary to prevent future terrorist attacks. So the ethical question here is whether curtailing civil liberties such as privacy, freedom of movement, can be justified in the name of national security. Many argue that these actions are necessary to protect the greater good, while others believe that sacrificing basic freedom undermines the values democratic societies are supposed to uphold. The USA Patriot Act allowed for significant intrusions into individuals' privacy right, such as surveillance without warrant in certain cases. So, increased surveillance and security measures many times lead to racial profiling and discrimination, particularly against minority communities. For example, in case of 9/11 itself, Muslim communities in the US and Europe were subjected to intense scrutiny, sometimes leading to stigmatization of the entire communities for the actions of a few. So, balancing civil liberties and national security is an ongoing ethical dilemma that requires careful thought to avoid injustice and uphold the principles of fairness and equality. Then, another ethical dilemma is associated with using torture as an interrogation method, as an counter to terrorism. So, the use of torture in counterterrorism has been a hotly debated ethical issue. States have employed torture techniques such as waterboarding, sleep deprivation, and stress positioning to extract information from suspected terrorists. The argument for torture is often framed in terms of utilitarian ethics, suggesting that if torturing one person can save hundreds or thousands of lives by preventing an attack, then it is morally acceptable practice. There are also counter argument against the use of torture. Those who give the counter argument, they say that the use of torture not only violates international human rights laws, such as the United Nations Conventions Against Torture, but it also damages a nation's moral standing in the world. So, torture can backfire by fueling resentment and further radicalizing individuals against the state. So, ethically, it is argued that no matter how dire the situation, torture should never be permitted because it compromises fundamental human rights and the rule of the law. Now, let us look at what's the stand of different normative theories on this act of terrorism. So, we'll be looking at the views of three major normative theories: deontological ethics view, utilitarianist view, and virtue ethics view. So, first of all, let us look at how deontologists look at the act of terrorism. So, deontological ethics, particularly from the perspective of Immanuel Kant, focuses on the morality of actions rather than on consequences of those actions. So, according to Kantian ethics, terrorism is inherently wrong, regardless of the goal it seeks to achieve. Kant's categorical imperative suggests that human beings must always be treated as ends in themselves and never as mere means to achieve some end. So, acts of terrorism, which often involve the intentional harm of innocent people, violate this principle. So, Kant would argue that no matter how noble the cause may seem, the intentional harm of civilians for political, ideological, or religious goal is morally indefensible because it disrespects human dignity. Now, if we look at the utilitarianist position, which is in contrast with what deontologists say, utilitarianism focuses on outcomes of action rather than on the actions themselves. So, from a utilitarianist perspective, the moral worth of terrorism could be judged by its consequences. If terrorism results in greater good for the greatest number of people, a utilitarian might argue that it could be morally justified. However, this approach raises questions about the cost to human life and suffering in the short term versus the potential benefit in the long term. Utilitarian ethics invite debate on whether achieving a long term peace, even through violent means, is justifiable or not. Now, moving to the virtue ethicist point of view, virtue ethics, stemming from the philosophy of Aristotle, focuses on the character of the individual and societies rather than the morality of individual action. This ethical theory emphasizes virtues such as courage, justice, compassion, and asks whether acts like terrorism promote or undermine these virtues in society. So, in the context of terrorism, a society that resorts to violence is seen as lacking virtues like empathy, justice, and peace. So, from a virtue ethics perspective, the goal should not be engaged in violence, but rather to cultivate a moral character and a peaceful, harmonious society that can resolve conflicts through dialogue and understanding rather than through destruction. For example, promoting peace education in communities affected by terrorism is an example of how a society can cultivate virtues such as empathy, tolerance, and justice. Virtue ethics would emphasize the need to build moral character and virtues in individuals and communities to prevent radicalization and promote peaceful resolution to conflict. Now, after looking at the ethical dilemmas around the act of violence and what would be the response of different normative theories regarding terrorism, let us look at some of the social ethics in combating terrorism. So, first one is education and social justice. So, social ethics emphasizes the role of fairness, equality, and justice in addressing societal issues. One of the root cause of terrorism is often linked to socio-economic conditions such as poverty, inequality, and lack of education. So, addressing these underlying issues is an ethical responsibility of governments and societies to create environment where individuals are less likely to turn to violent extremism. So, education in particular plays a critical role in combating terrorism by promoting critical thinking, tolerance, and understanding. By providing opportunities for education and improving social justice, societies can reduce the condition that breed radicalization and extremist ideologies. So, education is quite important if one wants to combat terrorism. Another is social ethics and the role of international law. International law plays a crucial role in defining the ethical boundaries of counter-terrorism efforts. Laws such as Geneva Convention outline the testament of prisoners of war and set limits on the use of force. When states ignore these laws, they risk undermining the ethical foundations of international cooperation and justice. For example, the question of how to handle suspected terrorists who have not been formally charged or tried raises serious ethical concerns about due process, anarchical profiling, and discrimination, human rights. Extradition, the transfer of suspected terrorists between countries, is another ethical issue. Countries often face dilemmas when sending suspects to nations with poor human rights records where they may face torture, execution. Example, Geneva Convention and the treatment of prisoners. The Geneva Convention provide clear guidelines on the human treatment of prisoners, including suspected terrorists. However, these guidelines have been violated in several instances, such as in Guantanamo Bay, where detainees were held without trial and subjected to torture. This raises serious ethical questions about how far states should go in pursuing security measures and whether these actions undermine the very laws designed to protect human dignity. Then, another role of social ethics as a counter to terrorism is to promote social cohesion. Ethical responses to terrorism also involve promoting social cohesion and integration, ensuring that marginalized communities feel included and valued within society is the key to reducing the appeal of extremist groups. Governments or organizations have an ethical duty to create policies that promote tolerance, equality, and integration, especially in immigrant or marginalized communities that are often targeted by terrorist recruiters. Fourth one is ethical responsibility of government and societies. Government have a key ethical responsibility to protect their citizen from harm while ensuring that justice is served fairly and without abuse of power. Ethical governance require that counter-terrorism efforts do not violate the human rights of the individual, whether through unlawful detention, torture, or discriminatory policies. Government must balance the need for security with the protection of civil liberties and avoid actions that could exacerbate cycles of violence. The ethical responsibility of rehabilitate former terrorists rather than purely punish them is reflected in programs that offer education, vocational training, and psychological support to the terrorists. These efforts aim to help individuals rebuild their life, thus contributing to long-term societal stability and peace. Now, apart from the government and society, citizens, individuals also have ethical role towards terrorism. In addition to government responsibility, citizen plays a crucial role. Citizens have an ethical duty to avoid spreading hatred, fear, misinformation, particularly after the act of terrorism. So we can see that in today's time of the technology, we also have a lot of responsibility. What messages are we sharing across WhatsApp, Facebook, or through any of these social media means? And we also need to stand against racism, discrimination, xenophobia. So, this is a key part of creating a more cohesive and tolerant society. So, communities can also actively involve in counterterrorism efforts by promoting dialogue, understanding, and showing empathy. Grassroots initiatives that promote inclusiveness and social justice are essential for combating the fear and division that terrorism seek to create. Now, having the final thoughts on today's lecture, terrorism presents profound ethical challenges, both in terms of justifying the use of violence and in developing ethical responses to such violence. Different ethical theories offer varying perspectives on the morality of terrorism, from Kantian ethics, absolute rejection of violence, to utilitarianist consideration of outcomes. Governments, societies, and individuals must navigate these ethical dilemmas carefully, ensuring that responses to terrorism uphold the participant of justice, human right, and social cohesion. Ultimately, we can say society must strive for ethical governance, promoting peace and justice without resorting to methods that perpetuate cycle of violence. The fight against terrorism should be grounded in moral principle that respect human dignity, protect civil liberties, and address the root causes of violence and extremism. Only through ethical action and dialogue can societies hope to overcome the threat of terrorism and build lasting peace. So, thank you everyone. I hope through these two lectures, one on the terrorism causes and consequences, and another one, terrorism and social ethics, you got the deeper understanding of this act of terrorism. Thank you for joining for today's lecture.